The Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations will come to order, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled "The Fall of ESG, Scrutinizing the Failed Use of Environmental, Social, and Governance Standards and the Influx of Proxy Advisors." And without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in their record. I'm going to now recognize myself for a 5-minute opening, and then we'll recognize the gentleman for, I believe, 4 minutes, and then the ranking member for a minute. So, across the country, investors are being held hostage by those who don't want to maximize retirement profits, but rather seek to push a far-left social and political agenda. The rapid rise and fall of ESG investing can be likened to the dot-com, or what it was also known back in the day as the dot-bomb bubble, and the eventual crash nearly 20 years ago. And just like then, investors have been leaving in record numbers. As of this summer, global investors have withdrawn over $40 billion from ESG equity funds, which have been plagued by poor performance and in some cases even scandal. The ESG movement has seemingly reached its peak, and investors, hedge funds, and companies are experiencing the costly effects of focusing on ESG initiatives rather than creating shareholder value. Regrettably, the ESG movement is being kept afloat by many familiar faces. Democrats, progressive activist investors, and proxy advisory firms themselves have conspired to push woke ideology on millions of unsuspecting and unwilling American investors. Let me be clear, this debate is not about whether investors should or should not invest in ESG funds. That is up to them. But it is about one simple fact. This is about something even more important: fiduciary. Firms have a contractual responsibility, a fiduciary duty to maximize shareholder return, period. And under this administration, activists are running amok, and Americans who are trying to build a secure financial future are instead facing lower returns because of those actions. The continued prioritization of ESG initiatives by the Biden-Harris administration and the regulators is a deliberate strategy to circumvent the lack of congressional support for progressive environmental and social policy measures. This approach undermines traditional and legal government structures and has turned our financial system into a political battlefield. Sadly, my friends on the other side of the aisle will paint a much different picture. During today's hearing, Republicans will highlight 3 undisputable facts. First, we will emphasize how the inclusion of ESG metrics in financial reporting documents muddies the waters for investors while taking companies' focus away from financial goals to quiet those climate activists. Second, it will debunk the myth that environmental and social funds outperform other portfolios. Simply put, they do not. And lastly, we'll highlight the conflicts of interest inherent in the proxy advisory industry. The proxy process is broken. It no longer promotes long-term shareholder value and operates without transparency or accountability. Activists have hijacked the shareholder proposal process, becoming the de facto standard setters for corporate governance policies in the U.S. Their heightened influence is increasingly concerning when considering the fact that the 2 largest proxy advisory firms and their willing advocates and allies control an estimated 97% of the market. Coupled with the recent hyperpoliticization of the SEC, proxy advisory firms have been given immense power to shift policy, often using a one-size-fits-all framework to promote a liberal social agenda. Companies have a decision to make. Will they stand by quietly and let bureaucrats and activists in Washington drive up costs and regulatory burdens, ultimately harming the very everyday investors? Or will they stand up to the out-of-touch, unrealistic policies being pushed by these activists and by the Biden-Harris administration? Republicans will continue to stand with the investors, those who are willing to save for retirement and working to build a more secure future. We will continue developing policies that prioritize returns, promote economic growth, enhance financial security, safeguard our capital markets for all, and yes, protect investors. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time. With that, the chair now recognizes the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 4 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the title of this hearing is The Fall of ESG, Scrutinizing the Failed Use of Environmental, Social, and Governance Standards and the Influence of Proxy Advisors. However, a better name for this hearing would be how some Republicans would like to wittingly or unwittingly use the United States Congress to deny investors knowledge of material risk in stocks offered or owned. And sadly, also how some Republicans are using the United States Congress to wittingly or unwittingly resegregate board rooms. Allow me to explain. On the subject of climate change, acknowledging the dangers posed by climate change benefits corporate America, as climate change is a threat to our financial system, as well as the global economy. If insurance companies and other investors do not account for climate risk, they will either have to go bankrupt or exit certain markets, exacerbating the recent trend wherein some of the largest insurance companies are choosing to withdraw coverage from certain states. Further, a 2023 study conducted by the asset manager Nuveen found that more than 73% of U.S. investors said they were more likely to invest in a company that communicates its plans for effectively managing ESG-related risks. With regards to proxy advisors, the proxy advisory industry benefits shareholders by providing independent advice and analysis that is not influenced by the biased management of a company may have. As a neutral third party, proxy advisors provide shareholders with information that corporate management may not be making available because of biases they may have. But this information will help the investors. When it comes to governance, diversity is a benefit, not a detriment. Diversity benefits corporate shareholders by improving a company's performance. A 2023 McKinsey report found that companies in the top 25% for both gender and ethnic diversity in their executive teams are on average 9% more likely to outperform their peers. On the other hand, McKinsey found that companies in the bottom 25% for both gender and ethnic diversity are 66% less likely to outperform their peers. In truth, this isn't about whether minorities and women are qualified. It's about the fact that they are minorities and women in a society that has historically discriminated against minorities and women. This is wittingly or unwittingly a form of nouveau Jim Crow. I will further explain during my Q&A. I yield to the ranking member.
The gentleman yields back his 4 minutes, and now the chair recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Waters, for 1 minute for an opening statement.
Thank you very much. Environmental, social, and governance, or ESG principles and practices are smart business strategies that benefit everyone. Last Congress, the committee received hours and hours of testimony explaining how companies that prioritize these practices foster innovation, improve employee satisfaction, and build stronger, more resilient businesses. It's just a fact that diverse teams consistently outperform non-diverse teams by driving better decisions and higher profitability. Shareholder proposals play a critical role, holding our public companies accountable and pushing for this type of long-term sustainable growth for workers and communities. These practices and the shareholder proposals that press for them help ensure fair wages, safe working conditions, and equitable opportunities, helping to reduce inequality and building thriving local economies. It's just smart economics, creating value for shareholders, employees, and society alike. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Today, we welcome the testimony of Mr. Charles Crain. Mr. Crain is Vice President of Domestic Policy at the National Association of Manufacturers. We also welcome Mr. Michael Frerichs. Mr. Frerichs is the Treasurer of the state of Illinois. And we also welcome Tim Doyle. Tim is the founder and principal of Doyle Strategies, but I'm going to take a moment of personal privilege. Tim and I have known each other for quite a long time, starting with his career as a prosecuting attorney in the state of Michigan. No, I did not know him professionally at that time. It was just recreationally that we had a relationship. But he then came out to Washington and has done a number of things, including working for 2 separate congressional committees as a senior counsel, and is acted as a general counsel at the American Council for Capital Formation, and is now, in addition to Doyle Strategies, is a senior policy advisor for Centerline Liberties, a 501c3 think tank, and previously had been with the Bipartisan Policy Center. So I want to welcome all of you gentlemen here today. And with that, Mr. Crain, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you, Congressman. Good afternoon, Chairman Huizinga, Ranking Member Green, and members of the subcommittee. As the chairman said, my name is Charles Crain, and I'm the Vice President of Domestic Policy at the National Association of Manufacturers. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today at a crucial time in the decades-long effort to bring appropriate regulatory oversight to proxy advisory firms. Proxy firms are powerful, unaccountable actors that pose a real threat to Americans' financial security. Manufacturers have been subject to these firms' outsized influence for far too long. Their errors and conflicts of interest put their own profits above Main Street investors' retirement savings. Their inflexible policies and their refusal to engage with companies results in one-size-fits-all recommendations. Their robo-voting swings investor votes in their favor, and they advance ESG agendas that ignore or even harm shareholder value creation. Now, despite these obvious flaws, the SEC under Chairman Gensler has taken steps to empower proxy firms rather than hold them accountable. Shortly after the chairman took office, the SEC announced that it would no longer enforce the common sense compromise 2020 proxy firm rule. After that non-enforcement decision was struck down in court, the SEC then rescinded crucial portions of the 2020 rule, an action that again was found to be unlawful. Now, the SEC is waving the white flag in the face of a challenge from ISS, which is the largest and most influential proxy advisory firm. ISS is suing the SEC over its authority to issue the 2020 rule, not just the rule's particulars, but the SEC's authority to regulate proxy firms at all. According to ISS, Exchange Act provisions that were designed to ensure that investors have both complete and accurate information somehow do not apply to proxy firms. ISS is arguing that the proxy firms are not, quote, soliciting proxies, despite the fact that they are advancing normative agendas, influencing shareholders, and often robo-voting investors' shares. The market has long understood that proxy firms' behavior does constitute a solicitation under the Exchange Act. The proxy firms have historically admitted as much. The SEC has for decades maintained that proxy firms are soliciting entities, and the 2020 rule is an amendment to the SEC's existing proxy solicitation regime. Now, however, the SEC is refusing to defend this well-established authority. After a district court ruled in ISS's favor earlier this year, the SEC is declining to pursue an appeal. What this means is that if ISS and the SEC get their way, not only will the 2020 rule be invalidated, but the SEC's hands will be tied under any future administration, and proxy firms could remain unregulated in perpetuity. The SEC's retreat has left the NAM as the sole defender of the 2020 rule. We're appealing the district court's pro-ISS decision to the full DC Circuit. But Congress has the opportunity to act as well. Congress can and should clarify that the Exchange Act gives the SEC the authority and indeed the congressional mandate to regulate proxy firms. This clarification should not be necessary, given the clear text of the law, but ISS's reinterpretation of an unambiguous statute and the SEC's abdication of its own authority mean that congressional action is critical, both for preserving the 2020 rule and for clearing a path for a future SEC to consider additional reforms. This subcommittee can also exercise its oversight authority to examine why the SEC never allowed the 2020 rule to take effect and is now abandoning its defense of that rule in court. And finally, Congress can and should enact reforms of its own that build on the 2020 rule from the SEC. Requirements like those from the SEC's proposed rule in 2019, before it was modified to placate proxy firms, or from Congressman Stiles' proxy firm bill, would go a long way toward protecting Americans' retirement savings from proxy firms. Better engagement with companies, draft review of proxy firm recommendations, limits on robo-voting, policies to avoid or correct errors, strict guardrails around conflicts of interest. Clearly, more work must be done to hold proxy firms accountable. In short, Congress should do what the SEC will not: affirm the SEC's clear authority, provide much-needed oversight and accountability, and help manufacturers and Main Street investors escape the outsized influence of proxy firms. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back his time. With that, Mr. Doyle, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Good afternoon, Chairman Huizinga, Ranking Member Green, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Tim Doyle. As the chairman has indicated, I'm founder of Doyle Strategies, where I provide ESG and corporate governance consulting services. Also, senior advisor to Centerline Liberties and author of a newly released white paper on the anti-ESG efforts at the state level. All my opinions today are my own and do not reflect any views of clients or associated organizations. ESG is a subjective concept describing dynamic, non-traditional economic factors that may affect financial returns. From early religious investors who excluded so-called sin stocks from their portfolios to companies integrating ESG into business decisions to maximizing shareholder value, stakeholders have long considered non-traditional financial factors. There is no one standard definition of ESG and no one way that investors or businesses incorporate ESG into their decision-making. This has created some confusion about what ESG is and how it should be used. To add some clarity, I find it helpful to divide ESG into its most prominent uses: integration and impact. Integration refers to incorporating ESG factors that have a direct and material impact on the economic value of an investment or business decision. Often termed as an outside-in approach, this method considers ESG factors as elements that can influence financial performance, risk, or value creation. The integration of ESG and investment involves evaluating these factors alongside traditional financial metrics to ensure that all economically relevant risks, including ESG, are managed. For businesses, integrating ESG factors involves embedding or integrating them in strategies that directly influence long-term value creation. The challenge is determining what constitutes economic relevance, as this can be subjective. However, the process is grounded in the fiduciary duty to maximize shareholder value or investment returns. The integration approach is prevalent among large Fortune 500 companies and institutional investors, but often overlooked in the political discussions about ESG. Impact, which is often described as an inside-out approach, involves leveraging ESG factors not just for financial returns, but to achieve broader societal, political, or ideological objectives. This method is more focused on addressing externalities, either mitigating negative ones or creating positive ones. In the investment realm, impact investing involves directing capital towards initiatives that align with specific ESG goals while still seeking a competitive return. However, in cases of concessionary investing, investors may accept lower returns in exchange for a desired societal or environmental impact. On the corporate side, impact often relates to what we refer to as corporate social responsibility or sustainability efforts, where businesses pursue broader objectives beyond profit maximization. This approach is generally more contentious as it blends economic goals with non-financial outcomes, which can sometimes conflict with fiduciary duties depending on context. The politicization of ESG that we see today is in part due to the lack of understanding of these different uses. On the one hand, claiming ESG is always bad misconstrues that ESG factors can be economically relevant for making an investment or business decision. Banning ESG is an attempt to prevent its use for political or ideological purposes. However, this risks excluding otherwise economically relevant data. On the other hand, while one company or investment strategy may find an ESG factor highly relevant, another might not. Therefore, asserting that ESG is always good, as is commonly done by those who believe societal issues should be solved through the capital markets, sometimes due to a lack of congressional action, reflects a misunderstanding. ESG factors do not always apply to every investment or business decision. Here, the proper venue for these society's greatest challenges, of course, is here in the legislature. The hyper-politicization of ESG has led to both academics and more recently Fortune 100 CEOs to call for either the breakup of the term ESG or abandoning it altogether. However, while this term ESG may be on the way out, responsible businesses will continue to evaluate non-traditional financial factors to determine their economic relevance. I thank you for the opportunity to speak today and look forward to answering your questions.
Gentleman yields back, and with that, Mr. Frerichs, you are now recognized for your 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. My name is Michael Frerichs. I serve the people of Illinois as the Illinois State Treasurer. I'm the state's Chief Investment and Banking Officer. And in that role, my office manages approximately $66 billion across 9 investment portfolios, which include $35 billion in state funds, $20 billion in retirement and college savings plans, and $11 billion on behalf of local and state governments. It is my job to protect and grow the hard-earned savings of families across the state, as well as the funds that state and local units of governments depend on to provide critical services to the people of Illinois. I take this responsibility very seriously. Whether it's a single parent trying to save for their kids' college tuition, an individual saving for a new wheelchair, or a town building a new library, my constituents are trusting the Treasurer's Office to grow returns on their funds over the long term, while ensuring they have access to the money they need in the meantime. With this mindset, I intentionally invest not just for the next quarter, but for the next quarter century. That brings me to why I'm here today. We are experiencing a widespread, politically motivated attack against investors who utilize data that has a material impact on our investment value and ultimately investment returns. We see this attack both in Project 2025 and even in the subcommittee hearing today. I am here to advocate for investors' ability to consider all data that allows us to perform our fiduciary duty to act with prudence, loyalty, and care. Although the term ESG has become highly politicized, using environmental, social, and corporate governance factors in the investment process has been and will continue to be a long-standing and common practice. There's a fundamental misconception that using ESG data is pushing a liberal agenda. This could not be further from the truth. It is simply about evaluating data that matters in long-term value creation for businesses. Investors like myself need to manage and mitigate all types of risks that may have a material impact on investment performance. Investors identify these risks by seeking data from many sources, both quantitative and qualitative, and from internal analysis, as well as with the assistance of consultants. The more comparable, accurate, and timely data we as investors have, the better informed our decisions are when selecting suitable investments. Some of the data that we use in our investment processes, emphasis on some, may be related to material sustainability issues. In those cases, integrating sustainability factors is the prudent approach to total portfolio risk management. In Illinois, it's also state law. The value of integrating sustainability factors is supported by both academic research and by common sense. Companies that value their employees' working conditions will have less turnover and higher productivity. This impacts their bottom line. Companies that build a strong governance structure will be more resilient to fluctuating market dynamics and business cycles. This impacts their bottom line. And when a topic, area, or issue impacts a company's bottom line, it impacts the value of our investment. If it impacts the value of our investment, it is important for investors to be able to assess and, when warranted, critique or voice concern to a company related to its business practices. Restricting the ability to access or use data to make investment decisions is fundamentally anti-free market. It is literally an Orwellian system where the government proclaims that ignorance is strength. Why would someone tell an investment professional to ignore data that provides insights into if a company has destructive labor practices harming workers? Our data or data that sheds light on excessive executive compensation packages that focus only on short-term profits rather than generating long-term value for shareholders. Or to ignore the fact that climate risks create real financial risk for many companies. The effort of trying to limit this data harms working people, retirement savers, businesses, and the wider United States by imposing real costs and limiting investors' freedom. My office exercises shareholder rights, including voting proxies, introducing shareholder resolutions, and engaging management. Exercising these rights is an important part of being a fiduciary, and shareholder rights are core to American capitalism. My office utilizes an advisor to help inform our decisions around how to vote proxy ballots. Their recommendations are based on prudent diligence, considering items such as company disclosures, academic research, or investment performance. They use data. Efforts to stifle the voice of shareholders by making it more difficult to file shareholder resolutions or use consultants interferes with investors' abilities to make their voices heard with management. Thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to your questions.
Gentleman yields back. We are now going to turn to member questions, and the chair is going to recognize himself for 5 minutes of questioning. And again, I want to say thank you to all of our witnesses for your testimony today. I'd like to stress an important opening point from my earlier statement. If an investor knowingly wants to put their money in an environmental or social fund, have at it. That is their prerogative. That is their right. And Mr. Doyle, you were starting to talk about integration versus impact, I believe it was, correct? And I want to explore that a little bit as well. I just want to make sure there's transparency and that it's a choice and that people still have a choice to maximize their returns. However, a major issue that investors face today is the undue influence of proxy advisors and their constant push to force companies to take on social initiatives, regardless of whether the initiatives work with the company's or the economic sector's business model. So, Mr. Crain, proxy advisors like ISS and Glass Lewis provide various services to the same corporations that they are hired to provide proxy recommendations to. This allows for a potential conflict of interest arising that may bias voting recommendations, in my opinion. Do you think that these groups need to be held to a greater level of transparency to prevent this?
I think they absolutely do, Congressman. The conflicts that proxy firms have are clear, obvious, and well understood. They offer consulting services to companies where they essentially go and tell them, we sure would hate to see you get a negative recommendation on this topic, but where's that negative recommendation coming from? It's coming from the proxy firm. And so they're offering a service to avoid a negative recommendation from themselves.
And what kind of threat does that pose to the investors themselves then?
I mean,
some people might say, well, so what? This is such an important issue. We need to put that pressure on.
I mean, ultimately, as you've indicated, all the actors in the market ought to be acting in the best interest of Main Street investors and their retirement savings. And to the extent that instead they're forced to act to serve these conflicts of interest, that does not serve Main Street investors.
It seems like there is some rising pushback on these firms and over that conflict of interest. So it's clear that on one side of the coin, we have a conflict of interest in recommending voting measures. Proxy firms are recommending approval of an ESG initiative and then get to double dip by consulting with the company on how to implement the initiative. That's what you're saying, correct?
That's exactly right.
Yeah, okay. And on the other side of the coin, there's a potential for an overload of information on climate and social data coming through financial reporting, which Mr. Frerichs was just claiming he needs. That coming through that I believe can muddy the water for information that's material to the company's return and what isn't. And I would just note that required to provide versus an option to provide are two different things. The law states if it is material, it must be provided. So it's not like anybody's hiding the ball. I believe Mr. Frerichs said restricting or outlawing data. Nobody's doing that. They're required to give that information. So Mr. Doyle, in your recent white paper, you state that individuals must be given the ability to adequately analyze all relevant facts and circumstances when making investment. And I agree relevance is important, and it was why materiality is a touchstone of our public company disclosure regime. With respect to social issue information, public companies already make those disclosures that are considered material. Talk about that materiality standard, in which has been in effect for decades and serves American investors, I would argue, very well.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman.
If you could turn your mic on as well.
Sorry.
And can you explain why non-material information also might affect investor decision making?
Yes, materiality is I think you referenced, I know in the past, and certainly we've talked about it, is a cornerstone of a disclosure. Really what we're trying to do is making sure that a reasonable investor, and there might be some debate about what that actually is, but that reasonable investor gets the information necessary to make an investment decision. And this has always been a balancing act, and the Supreme Court has talked about how you balance that between overloading a reasonable investor with giving, and as opposed to giving them what they actually need. And I think that's why most people would agree that materiality really is the standard to use. When it comes to non-material information, part of the problem is that it really can confuse the reasonable the reasonable investor. An analogy might be to this subcommittee is requesting oversight documents from an agency, and instead of getting back what you need to make your decisions, you are overloaded with documents that you have to then sort through to make a decision. So that's probably the biggest problem with the getting non-material.
My time has expired, so I appreciate that, and I'd love to get back to a number of things. Hopefully we'll be able to do that. And with that, as is his tradition and prerogative, the ranking member defers to others on the dais, and with that, Ms. Garcia from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the ranking member. By my count, this is hearing number three that we've had on environmental, social, and governance or ESG-related issues. Rather than addressing our nation's housing crisis or strengthening our banking system following the collapse of several banks last year, we're using yet another afternoon to talk about the quote-unquote fall of ESG. Well, so far, I've not heard about any fall because we see a positive effect on ESG policies that have had on companies' bottom line. In fact, a McKinsey report in 2023 found that companies that achieve stronger growth and profitability than their peers while improving sustainability and ESG scores deliver 2 percentage points greater total shareholder return than companies that excel only on financial metrics. That does not sound like a fall. I have said it before, and I will say it again, climate is financial risk. To not actively plan for climate change is to set your company up for failure. Shareholders and asset managers are aware of this fact. That is why they asked their proxy advisors to include ESG as a factor as they craft their voting recommendations. And Mr. Treasurer, I will start with you, and I'll call you Mr. Treasurer because I have trouble with Frerichs.
Frerichs.
Which is why you're Mr. Treasurer today.
Right.
You heard the opening remarks, something about muddying the waters, that it's a myth. What I just quoted would be a myth. And then there's all these conflicts of interest. I sat here through opening remarks, questions, and then 2 presenters, and I heard no proof or real substance in any of that. Did you?
Let me just say that a lot of what I heard, I don't recognize. This is not how we invest. I have seen attacks that take away data for us, data we use to make decisions. To put this in perspective here, really what we're talking about is the timeline of these companies. Do we want companies that are prioritizing short-term profits? Because you can have short-term profits if you treat your workers badly, if you decide you want to cut benefits. You can have short-term profits if you decide to stop investing in research and development, If you want to dump your forever chemicals in the waters around your area, you can save money today. But in the long run, that is going to cost your company a lot of money, because those employees are likely to be less productive. You're likely to have higher turnover.
And hurt the community around you. I mean, we can get rid of all those regulations, and I know I had another witness who said, well, it's all these regulations. Well, then what would you do? Just get rid of them and let all that air quality, harm our environment and you and your family, and with cancer, with breathing issues? Oh, well, no, I wouldn't want that. Well, then what do you do? But have you heard anything so far that leads you to believe that there's conflicts of interest out there and that nobody's doing anything about it?
I've seen no conflicts of interest in our investing. We work with proxy advisor firms. There are tens of thousands of votes that come up a year. My staff can't invest. We can't hire enough people to do this. It would be inefficient. So this is a market efficiency here that these proxy advisor firms have sprung up to help investors like us provide access to data. But we work with them to tell us our guidelines. Other customers may have different guidelines, and they may have different recommendations for different people. We follow up quarterly with these proxy advisors that we work with to let them know where we stand and review their decisions. No one is casting a
Proxy
robo.
advisors listen to the recommendations and policy preferences of the companies involved.
They work with us to carry out our wishes, just like a financial advisor might sit down with us and offer us advice if we told them when we want to retire, how much money we have coming in. They help us work through a plan.
So you just don't vote on your whim.
We do not vote on a whim. We vote based on data and research. And we use
Right.
proxy advising firms to help sift through mountains of data.
And you oversee almost $60 billion. Is that what I heard you say?
Correct.
So is there anything that you've heard so far that would lead you to believe that this performance issue is a myth?
This performance issue.
Yeah, well, the whole, that it's a myth that people who do use the ESG, that added matrix gives you.
I will agree with one of the speakers that there are different definitions of ESG, and there may be people who are doing something they call ESG that is not exercising their fiduciary responsibility, but ESG is data. When you use data to make decisions based on companies, you're exercising your duty as a fiduciary. If someone chooses not to look at this data, if they don't want to use it, that's perfectly fine on them. Quite frankly, I like it. Investing is hard. You have to put a lot of time in it, and if people don't want to do that.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Yes. With that, the chair recognizes the gentleman also from Texas, Mr. Sessions, for 5 minutes.
Chairman, thank you very much. Very interesting to have each of you here today and to talk about the explanation of ESG as data. I'm looking at information that we've been provided here at Financial Services. Bloomberg analysis estimated over $18 billion will be paid by small businesses to consulting firms, lawyers, and data providers, there you go with that data, with expertise in ESG risks because of their unfamiliarity with this level of regulatory scrutiny in the first 6 years. Seems like to me that if you own a small business or a small manufacturing firm, that does not exactly fit your idea of somebody trying to help you move your business along. Doesn't seem like that they understood that the way they wanted you to look is not necessarily how you need to look. It does not necessarily mean that where you're located in the marketplace or your competition or level of expertise. Mr. Crain, can you talk to us about this and the impact of this onto manufacturing, small business?
I think you're absolutely right, Congressman. When you think about the manufacturing supply chain, you should think about small businesses, family-owned businesses spread throughout the country who are trying to work for their local communities, create jobs for folks and their families, invest for the future. And so when you have a regulatory burden, especially one that's related to disclosure of information that either they may not have access to, it may be difficult to collect, or may not be relevant to their operations, that has a real and significant impact on that business and their growth potential.
I find it interesting that people want to tell you that their idea is a better idea than the way you were doing. that they want you to go and take on these new ideas. I have a number of times had discussion with people about ESG, about hiring, about what's in the best interest of a business, yet they say the market is the reason why you do this, to reach out to customers. Well, what if you really don't reach out to customer? What if you are a small manufacturing firm and you provide a widget that goes to a company to be a part of something? You really aren't in the world to provide things to a marketplace. How does that strike you, that they're smarter than you are? Or is this someone trying to tell you what to do and apply things to you that you really have to go to a lawyer and figure out, how would that apply to me? I am inside a chain, so to speak, provider. How does that work? And what does a regulatory agency think about that if they don't comply? Because in fact, all these issues that they talk about don't make sense to them.
So I think what you're highlighting here, Congressman, is that manufacturers are committed to providing appropriate information, whether that's within the supply chain. If they're publicly traded, it would be to their investors. Information that's relevant to them, that makes sense for their business, that supports their growth. But when we think about one-size-fits-all mandates, whether they come from regulators, whether they come from activist groups, whether they come from proxy firms, whether it's a downstream regulatory impact, because as you indicated, many small companies are in the supply chain for a larger company that may be subject to SEC regulations, that's when you have one-size-fits-all mandates that are less workable for these companies. Manufacturers want to provide the right information, do the right thing, but that's going to differ on a company-by-company basis as compared to some of these one-size-fits-all mandates that are so inflexible for these smaller businesses.
Going further, and we are talking about over-regulation, I think, just so we're not picking on just ESG, a 22 study estimated the SEC climate disclosure rule would cost up to $25 billion annually in the United States to live up to these recommendations. In other words, if you were going to make these changes that you were, as a result of the climate rule, that you took to look at what you did, how you did it, to ask questions, does that hurt somebody in the bottom line, or was that just you weren't smart enough to figure out if you abide by all these, somehow it will help the marketplace?
Those costs absolutely do hurt a company's bottom line, Congressman.
So, looks like I'm done. Well, I got 3 seconds low on 3 seconds over. I yield back my time. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Mr. Sessions. I do want to put into the record a Bloomberg Law article from September 9 of 2024. SEC's Gensler sees ESG plans thwarted as Biden term nears end. Without objection, that will be included into the permanent record. With that, Ms. Williams from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huizinga and Ranking Member Crain, and to our witnesses for joining us today. As the Congresswoman for Georgia's Fighting 5th Congressional District, I represent a region with a vibrant business community centered in Atlanta. Despite the success of many local companies, big ones, small ones, and everything in between, our city faces one of the largest racial wealth gaps in the nation. One critical barrier to bridging this gap is the lack of agency that underrepresented communities have over their investments. In a rapidly evolving corporate landscape, the role of proxy advisors and environmental, social, and governance, or ESG practices, has become increasingly important. These tools are pivotal for ensuring that investors, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds, have a meaningful voice in the companies they support. Proxy advisors provide essential recommendations that help shareholders make informed decisions on corporate governance and ESG issues. This guidance is crucial in an era where companies are increasingly judged on their sustainability practices, board diversity, and social responsibility, whether you agree with it or not. Effective proxy advisory services empower investors to advocate for changes that promote greater equity and accountability within corporations. For communities in Atlanta and across the nation, especially those that are historically underrepresented, shareholder proposals are a key mechanism for influencing corporate policies that affect their lives. Initiatives such as enhanced board diversity, equitable pay practices, and sustainable environmental policies are often driven by these proposals. These changes not only advance social justice, but can also improve corporate performance and long-term profitability. Recent proposals to limit the influence of proxy advisors and restrict shareholder engagement threaten to undermine these advancements. Some legislative efforts aim to narrow the scope of proxy advisory services and impose restrictive voting requirements on passive funds. These changes could significantly diminish the ability of individual investors, especially those from underrepresented communities, to have their concerns addressed and their voices heard. This is particularly relevant in Atlanta, where the business community's influence is substantial, yet the economic disparities remain stark. Limiting proxy advisors' roles and stalling shareholder engagement could exacerbate these disparities by concentrating decision-making power among a few, leaving underrepresented investors with even less influence over the companies they're invested in. As we discuss these important issues today, it is crucial to recognize that shareholder proposals and proxy advisory services are not just technicalities. They're vital tools for ensuring that all investors, particularly those from underserved communities, have the opportunity to shape corporate practices and contribute to a more equitable economic landscape. Ensuring that these tools remain robust and accessible is essential for fostering inclusive corporate governance and addressing systemic inequalities. Mr. Frerichs, given the significant economic disparities faced by underrepresented communities, such as those in Atlanta, how do shareholder proposals empower these communities to influence corporate policies that directly affect their economic opportunities and overall well-being?
We value diversity in our boards. We push for board diversity. We do that not out of a sense of it's our values, but it brings value to the company. There have been numerous studies that have shown that diverse boards outperform homogeneous boards. And so once again, this gets to, as a fiduciary, driving returns for our investors.
So it's not just good because it makes you feel good to have all communities represented, but it sounds like it's also good for the bottom line.
It is good for the bottom line. When you get a bunch of people sitting around a table with the same backgrounds, with the same education, they frequently fall into groupthink. There's a lot of head nodding and agreeing. If you get people from different backgrounds, they bring up opportunities that people from a homogeneous background might miss. So they have better opportunities out there. They don't miss on business opportunities, and there's a better discussion at the boardroom.
So considering the impact of proxy advisors and shareholder proposals, what specific benefits have these mechanisms provided to communities with severe racial and economic disparities like those in my home city of Atlanta?
Yeah, we couldn't do our job. We would have to hire a lot of people to research and go through the tens of thousands of proxy votes in a year. They are our partners in helping us get to that information that we find valuable in making decisions.
And I have a lot of questions remaining that I'm going to run out of time, but I want to talk more about past instances in shareholder proposals that have advanced social justice and equity within corporate practices, particularly benefiting marginalized communities. But I'm going to submit the rest of my questions for the record. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The chair will remind you could submit that for the record as well, if you so choose.
Thank you.
With that, the chair recognizes the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. Mooney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. My questions today will be directed to Mr. Crain. Proxy advisory firms have grown significantly in influence over the last decade. Certain firms like Institutional Shareholder Services, which I'll call ISS, provide both vote research and recommendations as well as consulting services. By introducing ESG-friendly proposals which force companies to adhere to climate activist goals, some argue that a conflict of interest is created, negatively impacting the benefits to the shareholder of a company as well as their long-term interests. And let me be clear, by climate change activists, I mean folks who want to shut down the coal industry, which provides very many good jobs to hardworking taxpayers in my state of West Virginia, and also make it hard to invest in oil and gas and other important and valuable natural resources. So, Mr. Crain, institutional investors like Vanguard have fiduciary duties to their clients, correct?
Absolutely correct.
And these institutional investors are the groups who use proxy services like ISS and Glass Lewis. Is that correct also?
Also correct.
Okay. Is there any fiduciary relationship that exists between the proxy firms and the clients of the institutional investors?
No, the relationship is between the proxy firm and that institution, but that doesn't carry through to the Main Street investors that that institution represents.
Okay. So would you agree that seeing a return on investment should be the driving factor behind investment decisions?
I absolutely would. As the chairman said earlier, individuals are free to invest their money however they would like to. But when it comes to an institution who's representing Main Street investors, teachers, firefighters, manufacturing workers who are saving to send a kid to college, they have one sole responsibility, and that is ensuring that their financial returns meet the need that they've set out for themselves.
I appreciate that as a father of 2 kids in college. In 2021, ISS ranked second in major ESG rating agencies. Glass Lewis sells ESG-related products to companies while also providing vote research and recommendations. Is it appropriate for these 2 proxy firms to promote ESG products on the one hand while providing voting recommendations on the other hand?
I think it's a clear conflict of interest, and I'll give you an illuminating statistic. ISS in the most recent proxy season recommended in favor of nearly 80% of environmental and social shareholder proposals. This is at a time when the SEC has opened the floodgates to increasingly prescriptive social policy proposals, and yet still ISS found a way to get to yes 80% of the time. I think it's really clear that they have a specific agenda here, and as you said, it ties directly to the consulting services that they provide.
Thank you for that. And as a follow-up, how does ISS or Glass Lewis come up with their vote recommendations?
Frankly, Congressman, it's a pretty opaque process. You know, they function as quasi-regulators in the market, but unlike an actual regulator, there's not a notice and comment process by which they develop their policies. So they, through some process, set their standards, and then they develop the recommendations off of that. But there's not an opportunity for really anyone to influence that, and so it's really unclear how they make their decisions. What we are concerned about, of course, is that it's driven by conflicts or other agendas that are divorced from value creation for Main Street investors.
Okay, and one more follow-up to that, because I still have time. To the best of your knowledge, does ISS or Glass Lewis consider any criteria, such as national security interests, foreign ownership, or the potential influence of state-owned funds may have on activist hedge funds?
It's hard to say, given the opacity of their process writ large, but to my knowledge, no, I'm not sure about that.
Okay. Well, thank you, and that exhausts my questions, Mr. Chairman. I'll go ahead and yield back the balance of my time.
No, thank you. If the gentleman will yield to me, I'll
Yield my time to the chairman.
thank you. I appreciate this. Mr. Crain, I want to, I know, this is my 3rd administration. This is the first time I have ever seen the SEC pull back on its authority. Even in a Republican Trump administration, they certainly didn't cede territory that has been well established. In fact, we've seen this SEC go the opposite direction, which has been nothing but be expansionist in their authoritative footprint. So I'm sure it's just mere coincidence that this is the direction that they want to go, right? So what message has Chair Gensler's SEC sent to the proxy advisory industry by dropping this appeal in the case?
So this is a real abdication of their authority, as you indicated. This is not about a reasoned debate about what should or shouldn't be the appropriate guardrails. It's about, can they regulate at all? They've said they can't, and what does that leave for the proxy firms?
Okay.
Free rein.
That time has expired. I appreciate the opportunity. With that, we are on the other side, have a waived on, meaning welcomed member of the committee who is not on the subcommittee, but someone who is going to be recognized. We have somebody on our side as well a little later on. But with that, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kasten, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for having me here. So I think many of us in this room have at various points in our life won elections, and I think it is safe to say that there has never been a vote where there hasn't been one party with a vested interest in maintaining some portion of ignorant voters. That's sort of the nature of things. And I can imagine a world where proxy advisors would be on either side of that. I mean, goodness knows there's people who get involved in our elections who are sometimes less than totally honest. I get that. They say you should never ask a question without knowing the answer, but I'm going to take a flyer here, and I'd ask everybody in the room to participate, staff, witnesses. Raise your hand if you are currently managing $1 billion or more of somebody else's money. All right, we got one expert in the room, so I'm going to focus on you. To what degree do proxy advisors influence you, positive, negative, or neutral? Because if their purpose is to spread ignorance, presumably you'd have a concern on that.
They're neutral. They help us to sift through mountains of data. We talk with them. We have things that we are looking for. We have thoughts on how we want to have them conduct their analysis, and they're our partners. Just like any company would go out and hire consultants. The consultants don't make the decisions, they help them to make decisions. Just like you might, with your own personal finances, go out and hire a financial advisor. That person isn't going to tell you where to invest your company. They will give you advice, but it's ultimately on you to make those decisions.
Okay, so the only person in this room with significant experience, and for the record, I think you said $66 billion you're managing, seems to be, at least among that population in this room, it's unanimous. Now, as against that, we've got this whole, that we've been a whole term of this anti-ESG legislation. As recently as I think last week, Majority Leader Scalise said in an interview that financial institutions are investing assets, quote, in their most favorite woke fund, and it actually gets much lower returns for hardworking people. There are, at last count, 20 states that have passed anti-ESG laws to require states to divest from financial institutions because they consider ESG factors. Is anybody aware of any states that are mandating that people invest in ESG funds?
None.
Nothing. So I agree with you, Mr. Crain, we should not have one-size-fits-all mandates, but the only size we've got is 20 states that are saying, thou shalt not invest in this class of things because I hate capitalism. Now, if that was in fact in the fiduciary interest, we got the data at this point. So, Mr. Crain, are you aware of the Texas Association of Business, the Chamber of Commerce? This has, their members are ExxonMobil, Chevron. Were you aware of their analysis of the impacts of the Texas anti-ESG bill?
I have not read that specific analysis.
Okay, we'll introduce it for the record. It says that Texas lost $669 million in economic activity, $181 million in decreased annual earnings, lost 3,000 full-time permanent jobs because of that law. Again, this is ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips. These are not woke folks, right? Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Rural Association. You familiar with their analysis of what happened, what cost Oklahoma?
I'm not.
All right, they said $185 million, $11 million a month they're losing. Arkansas Public Employees Retention, Public Employees Retirement System said 30 to 40 million lost, $7 billion just for teachers. I could go on and on down the list, but the point is we have these one-size-fits-all mandates that are mandating that people violate their fiduciary obligations because we don't want to be woke. We have one person on the panel who actually has experience managing money and has a fiduciary obligation who is saying information is good. Treasurer Frerichs, what would happen practically to your ability to do your job if we blocked access to Proxy and if we said all states in the country now we're just not going to give you access to this information?
It would be very difficult to uphold my duty as a fiduciary. If we wanted to maintain the same standard, we would have to go out and hire a lot of people, costing the taxpayers more money. And I think that's part of the reason why study after study and meta-studies have shown that these anti-ESG legislation are costing states money. If you really believe in the free market, we should let people make decisions. As I started saying earlier, like if you were, I'm not a gambler, if you were to bet on sports, you've got someone's statistics on the back of their baseball card. You also want to have access to other information as well to help make a good decision, whether you want to start that person in your fantasy football league or not.
I'm about out of time, but look, as I said at the start, there is always one party that had a vested interest in uninformed investors, and I'm proud to be on the side of supporting investor knowledge, and someday I hope that it's bipartisan to make sure that investors have the ability to make informed decisions. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huizenga and Ranking Member Green for holding the hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for taking time to be with us today. I want to start by following up on the line of questioning that Chair Huizenga started regarding the conflict of interest that is apparent in the service of proxy advisors. Right now, proxy advisor firms can recommend approval of ESG initiatives through the process and then return when the measure is passed to offer consulting services on its implementation. Mr. Crain, one of the most important points of this conflict of interest is the proxy firm's complete detachment from the success of the company or the impact of the proposal on the company's revenue and its operation. Even if ISS and Glass Lewis keep these issues separate, the lack of transparency on how they make vote recommendations, along with the lack of fiduciary duties owed to the investor, makes me think that they use their influence to push their products and services at the expense of the investor. Is that an accurate assumption?
I think it is, Congressman. They clearly have a financial stake really on both ends. They provide consulting services to help companies avoid negative recommendations from their advisory firm. And then if the proposal passes, as you just indicated, they're going to help you implement it. So there's a clear financial stake there and a significant lack of transparency given the SEC's unwillingness to enforce the 2020 rule that would have provided transparency into how they make these decisions and how they operate and what's really at play.
And my history tells me to follow the money, and so I think anyone who defends such a regime, I have to wonder, are they on the take along with these proxy advisory firms? In that same vein, there have been concerns raised about the concept of robo-voting, where asset managers automatically follow the recommendations that they receive from proxy advisors. A study of 175 asset managers by the American Council of Capital Formation found that the firms follow ISS's recommendations 95% of the time. For half of the entities, it's 99% of the time. Mr. Crain, how widely practiced is robo-voting?
So we know that robo-voting is a popular service that the firms offer. Former SEC Commissioner Roisman used to call this set it and forget it. The asset manager preemptively decides they're going to agree with whatever ISS recommends. ISS pre-populates the ballot and actually sends it. Then the asset manager doesn't even have to go in and press the button. So there is a real concern around, are folks who are utilizing these robo-voting services actually conducting the requisite analysis before those votes are cast?
Do you have concerns about this practice potentially breaching the fiduciary responsibilities of asset managers?
I absolutely do, and it's interesting. The SEC has been, prior to this SEC, aware of that exact risk. The same day that the Clayton SEC finalized the 2020 proxy firm rule, they put out guidance for asset managers, not for proxy firms, but for asset managers that said the SEC has just finalized this rule that put all this new information out into the market, conflicts disclosures, anti-fraud standards, et cetera. Asset managers really ought to go and look at that information before casting a vote rather than blindly robo-voting their shares. Unfortunately, this SEC has rescinded that guidance, but I think that type of policy is really important with respect to our asset managers living up to their fiduciary duty.
And Mr. Crain, with a 95% success rate on robo-voting, ISS and Glass Lewis are all but guaranteeing a follow-up meeting with their companies on how to implement the initiatives they recommended approving. What can Congress do to provide transparency in this process and root out this conflict of interest in our capital markets?
So the first step here is, I think, to clarify that the SEC does have authority. As I said in my opening statement, it's actually quite clear under the Exchange Act, but given that the SEC is unwilling to defend that authority in court, having Congress step in and say, yes, proxy voting advice is a solicitation and therefore the SEC can act, can regulate, is, I think, critically important. Additionally, Congress can step in and enact additional reforms that build on what the SEC has done, whether that's transparency around conflicts of interest, whether that's limits on the types of consulting services that these firms can provide. There's plenty of work that still needs to be done to provide more accountability to the industry.
I see my time is winding down, so thank you for your insights, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. With that, the chair recognizes Ms. Tlaib from Michigan for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. The pretense of today's hearing is that certain risks don't matter for companies or the families and retirees who invested in them. And apparently today, a company's social or governance practices, like whether they have effective policies for preventing and addressing sexual harassment, don't matter. However, when the FTC chair was here before this committee, it was obvious that everyone cared. Treasurer, to effectively carry out their responsibilities, what types of information, risks, or opportunities must fiduciaries consider? And I'm so sorry if you've been asked this question, but I think it's important to repeat why these factors are important.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Let me first start by explaining why we need new data. About 50 years ago, in 1975, the S&P 500 had about 17% of the value in the S&P 500 in intangible assets. Today, that number is about 90%. So the nature of value of companies have changed. 50 years ago, you could look at a car company in Michigan and say, well, how many employees do they have? How many cars are they producing a year? How many factories they have? You could look at these numbers. But today, Apple, the value of Apple is not $1 trillion because of the number of iPhones they're producing. It's based on their reputation, on their intellectual property. And these are things that are subject to additional new risks, reputational risk, litigation risks. These are things that we need to have this information for because we're making lots of investments in these companies, and we want to know, we don't want to put our clients' money in investments at risk.
No, you answered my next question. I mean, the anti-ESG movement is funded by the fossil fuel industry, which is poisoning my community. Figures like Leonard Leo and I think Peter Thiel, who are all seeking to line their pockets, to protect their profits by opening a new front in what many are calling the culture war, right? The issue might be fabricated, but the stakes are truly, really real for people not only within the company, but for so many of the folks that are impacted. The retirement savings for hardworking families and public funding are all on the line. After Texas passed their anti-ESG legislation in 2021, for example, disrupting the municipal bond market, look it up, public borrowing costs increased by roughly $400 million after they passed the anti-ESG legislation. Indiana's budget office has estimated that forcing pension funds to divest from firms or funds that use ESG factors could reduce returns by $6.7 billion. Again, documented. Treasurer, can you discuss how attempts to prevent the use of environmental, social, and governance factors can cost the public and the retirees?
So let's say there was talk earlier about these small mom and pop companies out there. What we're talking about today is our large publicly traded companies.
That's right.
The reason we have disclosures is because in the past they didn't disclose things and defrauded investors. Now, we have risks for us investors. We need to know what they are. If there's an individual small company providing a widget for a large international company, we should have access to know, is that widget made with child labor? Is it made with slave labor? Because that presents a real risk to our investment in a company like Apple. Just think of all those people who have iPhones. The number of people, if they found out those iPhones were being made by slave Uyghur labor in China, by children, there were people who would switch from iPhones to Androids. It'd be a big risk to the company. That's why this access to information for reputational risk and litigation risk.
Look, it's very
so
obvious.
important.
It's about shielding them from accountability. Let's just be honest. This is shielding them from accountability. If a company is facing significant climate-related risks, investors need to know. Period. Why not?
If you're an insurance
Transparency.
company.
Be honest. I don't know why we're trying to help them hide this information. It's ridiculous. Treasurer, last question. Can you discuss some of the issues? The climate risks always come to mind for folks, but for climate risk to executive compensation, that shareholders' proposals can force companies to disclose, and why those issues would be of interest to investors. I know it's clear, but I think folks, I love how you give examples. I think the American people need to understand implementation-wise why this matters.
There was talk about materiality. So not every company is impacted by climate risk as others. If you're an insurance company insuring homes along the Florida coast, as an investor, we want to know that risk. If you're in agriculture and there are droughts or floods coming into your farm areas, we need to know your exposure there because those are real risks out there.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I yield.
Gentleladies has yielded back. With that, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. So we've heard that from a previous member, Mr. Caston, that ESG influences don't exist. And now we're hearing how it's actually being funded, something that doesn't exist, by, the nefarious fossil fuel industry. So clearly it exists. We've seen it, heck, from community banks that have been told that they're going to put themselves at risk from the SEC, from various government organizations, to if they invest in coal companies, if they provide lines of credit to coal companies, to very large wealth management companies being told that there are ESG requirements that they need to follow, and then being repudiated by the CEOs of these large organizations saying, hey, that's actually against our fiduciary responsibility. So we know it exists, and the question is, how much does it negatively affect investors that aren't aware? We're talking about information, okay? There's a way of persuasion via an undisclosed bias that I think we all are aware of it in today's society, right? So you can be pushed into a particular investment without being told by those that are commanding it, because people do listen to their consultants, especially when it comes to wealth management and other specialized fields. So Mr. Crain, and that's why I find this kind of just a little ridiculous, right? The ESG push exists, and what we want to know is how much of a negative effect does it have, and what sort of teeth does it have, and the legal standing for the pushback, which I believe has occurred, perhaps very successfully, or somewhat successfully over the last couple of years. At least that's the sense I get. So, Mr. Crain, I'd like to just start with you. Would you feel that the pushback that has occurred on this issue by Congress going public, by other companies stating that this is something that's not in their clients' interests, has that tamped down some of the ESG directives that have existed?
So I certainly think it's still an ongoing issue. As I've said, manufacturers are committed to providing appropriate information, material information to their investors. Some of that information may be quote unquote ESG related, but that's very different than this kind of top-down mandate, whether that's from activists, as you indicated, or regulators, that takes away that freedom to make appropriate disclosures that are relevant to the business and the investors therein.
Yeah. And ESG should be a choice for investors, as was brought up about, Apple phones being made by slave labor. Yes, that's information, but that's not being deliberately pushed into one investment over another because of an ideology. Mr. Crain, I also want to ask you about this. I introduced the SEC Review Act to address the lack of transparency and accountability in the no-action process on shareholder proposals. The SEC shouldn't push policies in secret without proper oversight. Do you think the current no-action process for shareholder proposals is functioning effectively, or do you see areas where it has become problematic or even broken?
That's a great question, Congressman. In 2021, as I'm sure you know, the SEC staff issued Staff Legal Bulletin 14L, which essentially forces companies to include on the proxy ballot any shareholder proposal that raises an issue with, quote, broad societal impact, irrespective of whether that issue is in any way relevant to the company. And so what that means is that companies are receiving a flood of increasingly prescriptive, increasingly socially driven policy proposals that are less relevant to their actual operations. And under this new standard, the SEC staff is less likely to grant no action relief because they're complying with this guidance they put out, SLB 14L. So it's clear that that process is broken at the SEC, absolutely.
Great, thank you very much. Mr. Doyle, quickly, in your experience, has the rise of ESG initiatives blurred the lines between the fiduciary duty to maximize shareholder value and what one might see as a broader moral obligation for companies?
There clearly has blurred the line, and as I mentioned in my statement, it does go back to how people are using ESG and determine whether it is being done to create value as opposed to what might some consider creating values or bringing their values in it. So there's definitely a distinction between those things that needs to be understood at first.
Well said. I ran out of time. Mr.
Sorry,
Chairman, I
the
yield back.
gentleman's
Thank you.
time has expired. With that, the chair is going to recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Ogles, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, Mr. Crain, when I listen to progressive Democrats, you know, they're quick to throw in your face or our face the word choice, unless choice somehow works against their parochial political agendas. And so when I think about ESG, as the chairman so dutifully noted, that we're not against ESG in its right to exist or someone to choose to go down that path, but it's about choice. But instead, progressive Democrats suddenly abandon the word and are for mandates to the point of almost market manipulation. So again, piggybacking off what my friend on the left said, let's talk about how social activism has been harmful to investor interest, and perhaps give me an example.
So under this SEC, it's become increasingly easy for activists to hijack the proxy ballot to advance these narrow political aims. The dollar threshold to get a shareholder proposal on the ballot is extraordinarily low, just $2,000. So it's actually cheaper to take on a big business by having $2,000 worth of stock than it would be to take out an ad in the New York Times, right? If you've got a political agenda you're trying to press. And so we have seen under the staff legal bulletin that we were just discussing, the SEC has opened the floodgates to that exact type of activism, which is completely divorced from, is the company acting in the best interest of shareholders, and rather focuses on, are you achieving my personal political aims as somebody who has $2,000?
And in that process, I think what we're seeing is that this social activism is getting away from fiduciary responsibility and, again, driving political agendas that at the end of the day, it's the small investor that pays the price for that. Am I not correct?
You're exactly right. You know, companies want to focus on creating value for shareholders, including and especially, as you indicated, the small investor who's saving for retirement, saving to buy a new home. They don't want to be pulled into this political back and forth. We live in, unfortunately, a divided society where everything is politicized. Companies don't want to be inserted into the middle of that. They want to focus on growing their business, creating jobs, driving the economy, creating shareholder value for the exact folks in your district.
Well, I would say that is a great close to my time, Mr. Chairman, is this is about fiduciary responsibility. This is about getting back to the nuts and bolts and returning value to the shareholder. And with that, I yield the balance of my time to the chairman.
I appreciate the opportunity, and I appreciate the gentleman's work on our ESG working group. And we held a hearing down in his district on the impact of the climate rule, and that was very effective hearing from agriculture, from actual practitioners. Mr. Frerichs, I got a quick question for you. You wrote in an article in April of this year criticizing Exxon's decision to file a lawsuit against Arjuna Capital regarding a shareholder proposal. You argued that Exxon was silencing the voice of shareholders, stating, quote, "It's time to let corporations, politicians, and money managers know the voice of the few will not be strong-armed and silence the many," close quote. But in 2022, 72.9% of Exxon shareholders voted against Arjuna's proposal, and in 2023, 89.5% voted against it. So when does 73 and 90% of stockholders voting against a proposal, isn't that the voice of the many?
That is the voice of many. But they want to silence any shareholder's ability to put forward a resolution. Just because you have enough shares to file a resolution doesn't mean it will get passed. That's how democracy works. People have a chance they want to cut democracy off.
Reclaiming my time, do you believe that there should be no limit as to what proposals are made, or whether they should need to have any kind of threshold of acceptance? I mean, having something go down 90-10, does that not somehow disqualify that question? Not the organization or the shareholder, but at least that question for a period of time?
There are limits on thresholds.
Not under this SEC.
How often you can. There's an effort to raise those thresholds to a place where I think is anti-democratic. If a company doesn't want to hear from their shareholders,
is there a place in between what you believe is anti-democratic and 90-10?
We're arguing about the right to file.
No, I'm
a
asking
proposal,
you a question.
Not the
No,
right
no, no,
to
I'm asking
win
you a
an
question. Is there a landing spot between a question like that, losing 90-10, and what you believe is silencing the majority?
election. If the majority votes against, then it doesn't matter. Most of these shareholder resolutions are advisory.
I think we know
anyway.
the answer.
This was about punishing shareholders.
My time has
and taking away
expired.
their right.
The gentleman's time has expired. With that, the ranking member is recognized for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I especially thank the witnesses for appearing today. And I earlier made a comment about nouveau Jim Crow. I'd like to delve into it, if I may. Jim Crow is a term synonymous with invidious discrimination. And I said that minorities and women have lived in a society that has discriminated against them. It took women 144 years to get the right to vote, longer than that to own property in some places. It was all, including commonplace, for boardrooms to be all male. Black people suffered 246 years of slavery. Then Jim Crow, convict leasing, black codes, lawful segregation. Is it unreasonable for people who have suffered or had their ancestors suffered these types of atrocities to want to know the makeup of your board? Is that unreasonable? In Texas, my state, I love my state. I don't love a lot of what happens in my state, but I love the state. Let me read this to you. Effective January 1, 2024, a new Texas law prohibits public institutions of higher education from, among other things, establishing or maintaining diversity, equity, and inclusion offices, or hiring or assigning offices, employees, or contractors to perform the duties of a DEI. Is it really bad to have an office devoted to trying to bring about diversity within an institution or a business? Not mandating, but looking, trying to develop diversity. You got an all-male board. Wouldn't you want to find a way to diversify that? So let me ask Mr., and I'm going to take a stab at it, Frerichs? All right, so would you kindly,
Frerichs.
thank you, sir. Please forgive my mispronunciation, but would you
You have a much
kindly-
easier last name to pronounce than I do.
Okay. Would you please respond to my commentary?
I do want to talk about economic Jim Crow. One part of Jim Crow was people had to pay a poll tax in order to vote. That excluded all kinds of poor people. One of the efforts here is to raise the threshold for filing a resolution. You say it's too low at 2,000. There was an effort made to raise it to 25,000. So what you're saying is, if you are a poorer person, and you're not poor because about half of Americans can't afford a $400 emergency. $2,000 is not a low number for most Americans. You're saying that if you're a shareholder who doesn't have $25,000 to invest in one company, you don't get to vote. You don't get to have a voice. You don't get to file a resolution. There is no guarantee that your resolution is going to pass. There is no guarantee that the board is going to follow your recommendation. But if you want to be a public company, you ought to be held accountable to your shareholders. And what they're looking to do is to not be accountable. If Exxon doesn't want to answer or hear from their shareholders, they can take their company private, and they don't have to do this. They choose to be a public company, and they should hold themselves accountable, and we shouldn't raise thresholds so high that you're basically forming a modern-day economic Jim Crow.
I thank you, and I'm going to use my last less than 1 minute to compliment the ranking member of this committee. She established a subcommittee for diversity, equity, and inclusion, trying as best as we can to help corporate America understand the value of diversity, the value of inclusion. And I just want to compliment her because a lot of this is more about will than way. Do you have the will to do that which you know can bring about positive change? Or will you allow the status quo to dictate your actions and as a result, maintain the status quo? So to Ms. Waters, thank you for what you've done, and I trust that you'll have an opportunity to do it again. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, we have a second member who has waved on to the committee, someone who has done a tremendous amount of work. Regarding the proxy advisors, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Stile, and the chair of the House Admin Committee as well. So we can thank him for microphones that work finally. It had been a while. It had been a challenge. So with that, gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding today's hearing. Mr. Frerichs, if I can, you oversee about $60 billion between 9 funds. Is that roughly accurate?
Yes.
And you're a fiduciary to retirees, aspiring college students, and others. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you were referencing, as you go through, you're voting on a broad array of proxies in any given year. Do you have a rough idea of how many total votes you'll take in a given year?
Roughly somewhere around 22,000.
22,000. And you noted in previous testimony you rely on the advice and counsel of proxy advisors when making those determinations?
Yeah, we work with our proxy advisors on our guidelines, and they help us to search data.
Do you pay them for that service, or is that a voluntary service by the proxy advisors?
We pay them just like we would other consultants or other vendors.
And do you, in particular, do you pay ISS and Glass Lewis?
No, we work with Siegel Marco, and they have a relationship with ISS.
So you don't contract directly with ISS. You contract with Siegel, who then contracts with ISS. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Are you privy to what their contract with ISS looks like?
I have not read it, no.
Is that something that would be of concern if you thought there might be a conflict, or do you just not think that there'd be a conflict there?
We have quarterly meetings to discuss our analysis, our strategies out there. They follow them, just like I assume people here.
No, I understand. I understand. Right, there's a significant fiduciary duty. I mean, it's a lot of work to go through and conduct this many votes. That's why people rely often on proxy advisors, in particular the two behemoths, ISS and Glass Lewis. In a given year, do you know how often you vote in agreement with the recommendations of either ISS or Glass Lewis? Do you track that?
The vast majority of shareholder resolutions are near unanimous.
Sure.
So when you say 96% voted that way, many resolutions are just.
Sure. Understood. But do you track how often you vote in agreement with ISS or Glass Lewis?
I have not.
You have not. In your 2023 shareholder or annual report, I think was the title of it, you note that the Illinois Treasurer exercises its proxy voting rights to support proposals to increase board diversity, gender pay gap reporting, and the inclusion of diversity in a performance metric for CEO pay. You go on to discuss how those votes go further. You chose 3 topics. You obviously chose to not include other topics. How did you choose those 3, and how did you choose to exclude others in that analysis?
Well, in this report, it's not exhaustive, all the conversations and all of our strategies out there. Those are 3.
Those are 3 you chose to highlight amongst others.
If some other client had a different strategy, ISS would make a different recommendation than they make to us.
Sure, okay. And
so it's not a monolith. People do vote differently who are all clients of ISS.
And so those are the ones that you've chosen to highlight as a fiduciary for those people that you're overseeing in the 9 funds. As you review and analyze the recommendations of ISS and Glass Lewis through your third-party vendor, would it cause you concern if ISS or Glass Lewis had conflicts of interest that were not disclosed?
Yeah, just like we would have concerns with companies that had conflicts of interest that were not disclosed.
So let's take ISS or Glass Lewis. Could be either per se they have 2 parts of their business. One where they're contracting with individuals taking money, and another side, on the other side of a so-called Chinese wall, they're providing advice or recommendations. If they chose not to disclose those conflicts of interest, or if a conflict of interest exists, I'll phrase it this way, if a conflict of interest exists, would that be something that you would want to know prior to reviewing that recommendation from ISS or Glass Lewis.
If they weren't following our strategies, we would want to know.
Not whether or not
That's
they're
why
following strategies,
that's why
whether
we
or not they
follow
have
up
a
with them
conflict.
quarterly.
The question is whether, if they had a conflict of interest, is that something that you would want to know when you're reviewing their recommendation prior to voting?
We would want to know if there were conflicts of interest, but I understand.
So perfect. So you would want to know if there's conflicts of interest, and I think that's important. And so as we look, we've had proposals to actually force the disclosure of conflicts of interest, and we get massive pushback on that. And you have your recommendations. You're the fiduciary. You were elected treasurer of the state of Illinois by the voters of Illinois. You've highlighted some, apparently not exclusive, inside your annual report about supporting board diversity, gender pay gap. Those are things that all are worthy to explore. How you vote on it, that's a separate issue, but worthy of interest.
Thank you.
But then what we don't have is a disclosure of any conflicts. And so as we look at other things, it could be environmental, it could be a whole host of reasons that are going into this. I think it's imperative that we have disclosures of potential conflicts of interest or actual conflicts of interest in these proxy advisors.
Are you aware of a conflict that I should be aware of?
I'm aware of many, and we could have a robust conversation on it. Cognizant of my time, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Unfortunately, the time has expired. This is a perfect time, though, to note that without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions or further explanations or requests for further explanations for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. We respectfully ask that you respond as promptly as possible, and I would like to thank our witnesses today for your testimony. I think this has been a very helpful and productive time. So with that, we are adjourned.